What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hartness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Florentine Versteeg, and we speak about language as a privilege, and the impact of facilitating in a foreign language. So many more aspects. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. Now, lean back to enjoy the show. Florentine, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Yes, I'm excited and I'm curious. I was just sharing with you that I'm especially curious because I have no idea what we'll end up talking about. We have a few pointers. And we'll just follow the flow.
Absolutely.
And we always start at the same point. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And I don't doubt that you actually do.
I do. I call myself a facilitator. And I started thinking about this question when you sent it. I thought, when was this? And I don't know if I can pinpoint a time or a date, but I said to myself, probably before I deserved it. That's what I said.
Deserved.
Well, deserved, or maybe it was appropriate. So I think it's probably about 10, 12 years ago. That's when I started getting really into art of hosting and getting more into the facilitation world, which was quite emergent still at the time. And it felt like a coming home when I heard this word for the first time. It felt like, oh, this is what I do. This is who I am. This is what or at least, and now looking back, maybe I should have said, this is what I would like to do or what I would like to become. And I think it was a little bit of sort of a fake it until you make it sort of moment just to call yourself a facilitator, until I now feel, okay, now I can really embody the word and I know what it means. But so I think I started calling myself a facilitator about like 10 years ago, before I was deserving of the title. And now I really feel like I can start to embody it.
And I would love to dig a little bit deeper in what it means to deserve the title. So what has changed, or what would be the moment where you think, okay, I can now wear the title with pride?
I think we move through different phases as people. And actually for me, the movement in my sort of professional development, it feels like it goes hand in hand with sort of a society's development that I would like to see. So I was very young when I started working in international organizations and like Model United Nations, Model European Parliament, all those things. And that's you're the chairwoman or the chairperson. And I was really like, they used to call me like the iron fist of leading committees. I was my tight ship captain, quite strict about who takes a turn and where do we go. And so I was very much the sort of the control and command kind of leader, although I was facilitating processes around topics that I didn't know much about. So I wasn't necessarily about the content, but really about process. I was quite controlling. And then I had several experiences in especially international settings. And then, of course, moving to Brazil, where I lost my ability to actually talk, right? Because I was for 2 years without, the ability to communicate all these things. I really was sort of reborn into somebody who just listens more. And also I completely started feeling more the values of facilitation, much more than the tools and the tricks and the games. And for me, that's been the moment that I felt I was more deserving. So I felt there was a big shift when I started understanding that no matter what I do, whether it's a World Cafe or an open space or just a dialogue or even parenting, right? Or any kind of relationship, if I do it from the values of facilitation, then it doesn't really matter the step-by-steps or it comes from the right sort of attitude. And I think that when I made that shift, I was able to let go of a lot of control that I wanted to have over processes. And I really felt more, maybe deserving of the title of facilitator.
Wow. So what I hear is, I find it fascinating that the moment you lost your voice, so to speak, literally, because of the language barrier, something shifted, that you were more grounded, more into the listening and letting go of control, meaning trusting the group, that they will eventually get there without your control. Yeah.
That's been, I think, one of the most humbling processes of my life was to move and learn a different language, because you get to, one, reinvent yourself as a foreign, like you come with a complete clean slate, and to really listen. So I grew up in a very multilingual family, like ridiculously multilingual. And there was always a language. Like wherever we traveled to, one of my parents would speak fluently the local language. It was never an issue. My grandparents, one of the most precious moments I have of them together was them gossiping at a wedding in Swedish, because that was the only language that nobody would speak. So there was like French and Italian, but there was like, no, in Swedish we're safe. So we had this like a huge availability of languages growing up. So I was never confronted with, what if you can't communicate? What if you don't know what people are saying and you can't be funny, intelligent, charming, smart, all these things that you naturally can be with languages? You can just smile and say yes or no, or pay attention to the if it goes up, it's like positive, and it goes down, it's like negative, and then you shake your head accordingly. So you have to pay attention so much to body language, to culture, to how people like to, use their language, jokes, slang. It was a complete rebirth for me of what actually language also means. And for me then with that facilitation, because once I started to be able to facilitate in Portuguese in this case, but even in English, which is not my native language, I felt really empowered, because I'm more careful with the words that I choose to make sure that it fits not only in the linguistic setting, but also in the cultural setting, of course. So,
wow. There's lots to unpack, especially on the topic of how much can you communicate and understand without really understanding the words. And what did you learn about these soft topics of sensing the room, or understanding a group or even an individual beyond the words that they are spoken? Can you put it in a nutshell? What have you learned from this transition?
Well, I've learned to really put people first. That's the first part, because I come from a North European, and I don't want to generalize like all North Europeans, but I come from, of course, a North European culture where we are a lot about, if you think about like a meeting or a gathering, about agendas, about the minutes after after the meeting. Everybody needs to be on time. Everybody needs to follow the schedule. To a culture, again, generalized, that's much more about people. So for me, that shift was forced in a way because of the language, because I had to pay more attention and I had to look at the little subtle signs, but also by the culture that I was immersed in. So I came to Brazil and I started working for the Impact Hub in São Paulo, and I was running educational programs there. In every meeting, I would start with my agenda and who's the minute taker, or I would come into the Impact Hub and I would just open my computer, start to work. But that's not what it's about. It's about people. You have to sort of take half an hour to sit, like to talk, to say hello, to ask about somebody's grandmother, to talk about the weather, or very profound things like work and what does innovation mean to you before you actually get to the juicy stuff. So that's really what I learned from this sort of picking up on body language and culture. Even if you don't know the language really well, if you take time to do that connection, whether it's just, can I get you a cup of coffee, or do you want to just sit here and help me a little bit with this language moment, that's much more important than any define the objective of the meeting or define the, at least both are important. But I think for sort of finding a midway has been really relevant. And I used to work a lot with kids. I've grew up a lot in CISV, which is an international organization for exchange programs. So I worked a lot with 11-year-olds, and we would do these exchange programs where the kids could not talk to each other. So we would have kids from 12, 14 different languages for a month together. And if you follow how kids actually have no problem spending a month together without talking to each other and without understanding each other properly, you see that actually as adults, we can just copy that. They play, they show each other things that are precious to them. They make jokes. They try to calmly explain things to each other. They have gestures. They invite. They hug. So there's so many things that we as adults can also just take on beyond just talking to each other that I think are so beautiful for us.
How would you incorporate that in a workshop?
So I've been trying to do that more because I've been privileged to work with different sort of nationalities in a global setting where this became very relevant, right? So, and we always converge towards English, but there are so many ways we can not do that. And where we have more symbols, where we have more drawings. I love visual aids during facilitation. It's really one of my main things that I think we can work much more with. Using common signs. I think even emojis, although they come with like the phones and the WhatsApp, they're such a powerful language that we have created universally that work everywhere. So how do you feel? Emoji. So if you don't know the word for flabbergasted or super frustrated, put an emoji on it, and then people will understand colors, any kind of symbol from nature that speaks to us. Make a weather chart. There's so many things that we can do that have this universal sort of language understanding underneath. Music, laughter, all these things for me have become much more important in these kind of workshops to avoid going into very brainy words or making words the center of what we're trying to do.
And I'm just wondering that very often, so when we use words, we put so much importance to the words, and we're quickly into judgment and stereotyping and putting people into boxes. And when we're taking away this opportunity, and I'm now thinking of dancing or the embodied work where it goes beyond words and how powerful it is. And then there could actually be a huge opportunity in leveraging this language gap or lack of a common language in groups. You have to find another way of curiosity for each other.
Yeah. And this for me is so fascinating because we really underestimate the role of, I'm going to call it language privilege, but let's also have like in participation, because we as facilitators have this role in which we need to enable participation and collaboration and contribution by all. And we tend to do that in a really equal way, right? We offer everybody the same opportunity, even though everybody's different. Mm-hmm. So instead of doing this in an equal way, we need to look for this sort of equity way, right? Where we can offer different solutions for all these different people we have in the room to help a little bit with this enormous language privilege that we have. So and not only in terms of like the fact if you speak well English or not, but also if you grew up in a household where it was common to have arguments or conversations, or you grew up in a society where it's very common to question or to argue and, to argue for your opinion or not. So we tend to sort of organize our facilitation around a participation that's very easy for these people who talk easily, even if they don't speak English or whatever the spoken language is perfectly. If they know how to express, they're extrovert, they know how to argue, they sound intelligent, we'll move towards that. So how can we, especially in our role as facilitation, where really it is our main objective is to include everyone and to create this safe environment, create different opportunities. And I always think of these, Netflix has an endless amount of these sort of competitions, right? Like baking shows, and you have now Lego masters, and you have the glass blowers. These are all people that not necessarily maybe were taught to speak or to have a beautiful language, but they have so many ways to express themselves in their art, in their creations, whether it's a cake or it's a Lego manifestation or it's a beautiful work of glass. That I think, how can we also have these different languages in our participation? That's not just about the spoken word.
Thank you for pointing out this language privilege. Because when you said the word, I was immediately thinking of, the language we speak. So we speak all English. And if you're slower in English, yes, we do judge, even unconsciously. Or we get impatient, especially when you're a fast thinker, fast speaker, we do get impatient with these participants. And there's so much more to that. Yes. How did we grow up in our communication styles, and how comfortable do we feel to speak up? And how easily do we feel safe enough to question? So how do you equalize then a group? How do you bring them together? And what are some tools maybe to work against the language privilege?
Well, I don't have the answers. That's one. I don't. It's my quest. Because what I've noticed, like with a lot of things, and online has made it even more immediate, we convert very easily towards efficiency. It has to be fast. We have to have a complete learning experience in 1.5 hours for the whole company. And so there's no time to translate, to wait for somebody who has maybe speaks slower, or somebody who needs to think before they speak, right? Which is, I'm sure, half of the population. So there's no time for that. It's just all so efficient. So the first thing for me is always to take this need for efficiency out of my design and to really focus on what is effective. And effective is resilient, it's sustainable, but it takes time. You have to sit down for it. You have to wait for it. It takes, like with me, 2 years until you can actually fluently express yourself. So if you rush that, but it feels like we're fighting against a very enormous current, because everywhere it's efficient. Like I struggled a lot in the pandemic with this 1 hour videos online. That's like your whole course on facilitation. And that goes out to 1,000 people, and that's it. No participation, no conversation. Just watch the video in your own time, and then you'll know it. It feels like, this scene from The Matrix where they plug themselves in to the machine and to learn how to fly the helicopter. Mm-hmm. It's as if we want to try to do that all the time. Like we just want to plug in, know something. So taking that out of the equation, anything we design, I think is really a first step. And so I met a wonderful person who works with this, Nancy Jimenez, who works in the US with this. And she comes from a Spanish-speaking background, and she is trying to liberate Spanish and also indigenous languages in the US. A completely different conversation. And so she taught me a lot of tools about language liberation, where you take the time in different workshops to do simultaneous translations. So even if nobody speaks that language that it's being translated to, that doesn't matter. That person who speaks Dutch, Armenian, any kind of little language, let's put it like that, still has the chance to hear their language being spoken. So I would be, you would be facilitating in English, and I would, for about 3 or 4 minutes, translate to Dutch next. So it's not simultaneous, right? It's like parallel translation. And it doesn't matter if it's relevant or if it's needed, but it's important for me and for my safety and for my participation to feel empowered. So, and now taking it back to, maybe Dutch is not a good example because a lot of Dutch people are confident in English. But if you take it back to Brazil, so I was running a program in the Americas for women empowerment in a technological company. And there's Canadians and people from the US who are native speakers. And then we have a lot of Spanish speakers and Brazilians, Portuguese speakers. And the company language is English. So that's fine. But at the same time, I saw all the time in this program, these women struggling to be able to express themselves as fast or even to understand the native English speakers. So I pointed this out. My co-facilitator was Venezuelan. So I said to our manager, right, I said, we could do some sessions, like in English, but also in Spanish or Portuguese, or play a little bit more with it, right? So if people want to answer in Portuguese instead of in English, and then we translate it or put some slides in Spanish and there was just no discussion. There was no conversation. There was not possible. There was like, these women, if they want to be in leadership positions, they need to speak English. And I said, well, that's easy for those who were born English. As if speaking English is suddenly a leadership quality or something I thought it was so frustrating. So there, not specifically in this program, but in other programs that I run that are Americas based, I always take time. I suddenly put a slide in Portuguese or in Spanish just to say, yeah, English speakers, it's really hard. Like, not to put them down. It's not like you don't want to sort of get participation from them down, but say or start a session in Portuguese. And to say, we'll do some translation later, but I'm going to start in Portuguese. Or because what I want to avoid is putting breakout rooms or connection rooms, right, in Portuguese only or Spanish only, because then you segregate.
Yeah.
want to make sure that the whole mix is in the room, and that the patience that people who are not native English speakers need to have to understand and to speak is also required of those who are native English or whatever the dominant language is. So everybody needs to be a bit more patient and take the time and be aware of it. That for me. So there's not a sort of a tip or a trick, but it's like you need to just slow down. That's basically the main thing.
And it's almost a wicked problem that on the one hand, we do want to mingle them, to bring them together, because that's the main reason we're in a workshop in the first place. So if one of our core beliefs is that the answers and the wisdom is in the group, and in the diversity of the group, then we want them to speak with each other, and especially to cross-pollinate the ideas. And to slow down, we need to somehow infuse curiosity. Because only if I care for the person, I mean, if I'm in love with someone, I have all the patience in the world to understand what they exactly mean. If I don't know the person, then I get more impatient and I just want to run through it. So it's an interesting question how to trigger this curiosity and maybe just a little bit more empathy, because we quickly forget and then fall into judgment of, oh, this cannot be a person in a leadership position because they cannot articulate themselves.
And we've been seeing this, and I think it's actually quite damaging, and we need to be quite aware of this. In any kind of literature, TED Talks, leadership development theory, everything comes, well, okay, let's not exaggerate, but a lot comes from native English speakers, a lot of white people from Northern Europe, Northern America, and you see that it's just easy for them to come across as very smart, to come across as knowing things better. And if we want to diversify, we'll get women, but they'll still be native English speaker like Brene Brown. Wonderful. But we're still in the same category of people who are not only dominating these fields, they're defining these fields. Yeah. So we come across these theories of trust or theories of psychological safety or theories of leadership development. They're all based or created. They're based in these cultures and created by people who don't have this connection to these other cultures, enormous amount of languages. And what I see, for instance, here in Brazil as well, so there's this, and I'm stereotyping here, but so there's an enormous Brazilian culture, but they feel like they're doing it wrong because they don't adapt so easily to these theories. And then they start reading these books and they say, oh, so to be a leader, we need to follow Simon Sinek. We need to know how to organize things like that's the way it should be because that's the right way. And so you're actually creating a completely new colonization of knowledge of leadership development because these people don't have a voice to say, well, I'm a super cool Brazilian leader, but just because when I do a TED Talk, I have an accent, my video might not go viral. And again, Miriam, I'm exaggerating very strongly here, but it's a little bit dangerous that if you look at people indicating, my books to read this year, if you look at the authors and how many of them are native speakers and white native speakers and men, it's really, I think it's something we should really start to challenge. So for me, the main thing is take the time, be empathic, and empower. So if you look at science fiction movies, there isn't any science fiction movie that doesn't have a super cool translation pin you can put on, like the Babelfish, right? In the
Yes.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
Let's focus on this. Let's put a lot of money into translation apps or translation pins so that we can all speak our own language and just hear our own language. And then it doesn't become such a barrier and it doesn't become so concentrated in one dominant language to stimulate the diversity of these things, right?
There's so much to unpack. So one part is, for instance, English is the first language in many countries that are not the US or the UK. Mm-hmm. So English is first language in South Africa, in Nigeria, and in India. So in India, I think you have 820 different languages. So if two Indians from different provinces meet each other, they would speak English to each other. And still there's a huge bias across the world when they hear someone with an Indian accent speaking English, although it's excellent English.
Yeah.
So this is yet another layer that we cannot only say it's mother tongue. No, it's a very specific sound of, air quotes, mother tongue that we give the label, oh, that's professional.
It's David Attenborough or nothing, right?
Yeah.
Like it's really, it has to be. And that's what I find so frustrating sometimes, because even between you and I, we both have beautiful native languages that are much more similar to each other than they are to English. We could find a sort of a German Dutch to find each other, and we do that, right? Like you say, like, oh, do you this word? It's this word in German. I don't know the English word. We find each other, but I always wonder how much we're losing by doing these convergence, and also by excluding these accents, and not only accents, because like I told you before, I spent some time in Nigeria. Also, they have, I think, about 600 languages, but English still dominant. Not only do they speak English, they've enriched English with wonderful words and slang and ways to express themselves that we're cutting out. So even the English language itself is much bigger than just the sort of. But again, I don't want this to become like against the Americans, or because it's not the point. It's this sort of, because between us, German, Dutch, we also find this English together. So it's a sort of a general thing. For me, the big fight is more against the need for this efficiency where you lose so much in diversity.
Yes. And I'm really enjoying this conversation. And I don't think, yes, we have to stereotype a little bit, but it's part also, I think, to peel the onion and see what's really there. Because what you just said, it's the exclusion by using English. And the funny thing is that we mostly use English because we want to include as many as possible. Yeah. And thereby we exclude. So, and I think there's always the kind of the tension between inclusivity and exclusivity, and how much do we actually exclude by being inclusive, the other way around. Yeah. And also I wonder, especially since you mentioned all the new words in Nigerian English, there's so many words that are not translatable in other languages. So I had a podcast interview with Cynthia, who is in Uganda. And she was also mentioning that most of the facilitation books are written by middle-class, white, Eurocentric or US American facilitators for this audience and not for an African audience. And then concepts like vulnerability have either don't exist or have a very different connotation. And then you mentioned psychological safety. What does psychological safety actually mean in different countries and their cultures? Yeah. And if we're using the same word, do we actually mean the same thing? And then even with a bubblefish,
that's
you might not be able to. You might not be able, or maybe you would even create more misunderstandings, because we suddenly have the illusion of understanding each other, and we forget to ask the question whether we actually speak about the same thing when we use the same word.
That's true. That's absolutely true. I think there's it goes so much. It's such beyond the words, right? I mentioned also for you the example of trust. So there's this theory about the trust equation, right? So it's like the equation that you use to create trust in your team, or between the leader and the people of the team. And it's all about accountability. And it's a Eurocentric theory in that sense. But the word, it's the same, right? So if I talk about trust here in Brazil, even though it means different things and the equation is very different, you need to go beyond these words. And so but even to create an equation, is it needed, right? So it's like, so there's so many different layers to that problem with language being, and there's this whole debate, right? Does language really shape our world? Does a culture really shape our language? Are we shaped as people? So I wonder how much of that you would be able to bring across. Yeah, a babblefish is a shortcut again, but I think there's so much there to invest in, at least allowing people the space to speak their own language. And then if there's a word that doesn't necessarily translate, we have in Dutch, right, gezellig, You have a bit in German, gemütlich, I think. It's very close. It's so much about the culture. You can't translate it because in Brazil, the sun always shining. You don't go inside for a gemütlich or a gezellig, and you don't light candles or do things.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen because you're on the beach. So there's something like cultural things that, if you translate them, but you can describe and you can at least create, like you mentioned before as well, the empathy. Visual for me, again, super important to be able to describe that. And then I think you really stimulate more participation if people are free to use their own words as well.
So I'm thinking of a never done before workshop that Grace Lau hosted once upon a time, called the Tower of Babel, where everyone spoke their mother tongue. And the question was, can we communicate with each other without understanding each other's words? Yeah. And what I found fascinating was, yes, we could understand each other, so we could get the core message. And even deeper than that, and that's something that I wonder whether we can use it, incorporate it in our facilitation more, is to see someone's real nature coming out when they have the opportunity to speak their mother tongue. So it's not really about communicating information, but it's about showing your personality. Yep. And I think through that we can create a lot of trust or connection with each other, because I think it's this layer of authenticity when our brain very often, so we detect liars because the body language and the facial expressions do not translate in the words. No. And our side somehow makes sense of that. And that's why we don't trust people. And I wonder whether if someone doesn't feel confident in speaking a language, I assume that our brain gets all confused and then we cannot trust this person.
Yeah. No, but I think that's the most important, even more important than understanding each other perfectly is exactly this point, like to empower participation despite language differences, right? So it's exactly what you're saying now. So whether people will understand 100% of all the words you're using or all the expressions, it's most important that we can enable this contribution and enable this participation by offering spaces where you can express yourself in your mother tongue through other means that are more comfortable to you. Because again, we mentioned this in the beginning, even if you are speaking your mother tongue, but you weren't raised to articulate or to formulate perfect arguments for your thoughts. This is also another barrier. So we need to constantly see ways we can allow people to express themselves differently with the empathy of the others in a safe space. So, and then some things might get lost in translation, but as long as people feel empowered to participate and contribute, then you have, for me at least, that's the main objective always of facilitation. So.
Yeah. And then obviously it depends on the context and the goal of the session, but especially when it's about people issues, in air quotes, or bringing people together, or creativity, team building, I think it's incredibly important. You mentioned that and I find this fascinating, that someone who is so focused on words. So you mentioned that you've been a facilitator, although you didn't deserve, air quotes, the title for your entire life almost, to move to another country where you don't speak the language. And me personally, so I was in a French kindergarten. Okay. So I grew up speaking French, and nowadays I almost have no accent when I speak French, but I'm missing vocabulary. So that's very interesting, because when I speak to French people, they might think that I'm a little bit stupid because I'm missing the words, but they cannot hear that I'm from another country. Yeah. And still I have the impression that I'm a different person when I speak French as opposed to English or even German. Yeah. And I wonder to what extent you experienced the same, and how did it affect your facilitation beyond just being calmer and listening more?
So I think I completely agree with you. It does really change your personality, right? Not your personality, but it changed a little bit about even the tone of voice. It changes your body language. Because I have my most intimate relationships in English and not in Dutch, because I'm married to a Brazilian who doesn't speak Dutch, or he understands a little bit, but it's not fluent. So we've always spoken English at home, even when I started learning Portuguese. And so you start really creating a deep base of a relationship, very intimate, in a language that's not literally the mother tongue, right? And in the beginning, I that was really hard. And I felt that sort of streamed through in a lot of things that I said to him, but also in my facilitation, is that there's sort of a part of my personality that he could never really know, or that in my facilitation could never be, because it's the Dutch part, right? And I even noticed, now I've been away from Holland for 13 years, so I've been speaking mostly English and Portuguese for 13 years. You lose a little bit of that part. Is it good? Is it bad? Was it meant to be to lose it? I don't know. Is it just part of my evolution as a person? Possibly. But I notice how sometimes my body physically relaxes when I speak Dutch. It's incredible. Like the other day, I was in an NDB workshop with Sarah, who lives in Holland, right? And she started speaking Dutch. I was like, oh yeah, we can speak Dutch. And Nadja as well. And I was like, oh, and it's there's a sort of a physical reaction of, oh, and it's really interesting. And I struggle even now in Dutch to really be, smart and articulate, because I don't do it on a daily basis. So, but there's a sort of So in my facilitation, I think I'm already happy when I can do it in English, because that's much closer to my native language, or for at least closer to me than Portuguese. For the facilitation, I was just preparing now a workshop I'm running this afternoon in Portuguese, and I was making the slides, and it's about how to make good questions. And then I'm really careful about my language, more than I would be maybe if I did it in Dutch or English, because I need to be so careful. So I use still today Google Translate to help me find the perfect word for the thing I want to say. So in my facilitation, I'm more succinct, like I'm more precise, because I chose my words more carefully. Because I have less vocabulary, I can't elaborate endlessly. So I'm always very to the point and more careful. So I understand what word comes across. I play with it a lot, because I think what's fun about being a foreigner is that you have an exclusive view of a language that insiders don't have anymore. Right? If it's your native language, you don't realize certain things. And for me, they're funny, or they call my attention. And then I call them out during the workshop. I say, isn't it cool that we use this word in Portuguese, and actually this connects to this? Or isn't it interesting that this is a feminine word and this is a masculine word, right? Because they grow up with that. And for me, it's still novelty. I'm like, oh yeah, that's cool. So I point that out. And I hope with that sometimes to enrich their understanding of their own language and how they can use it. So I try to do it more playfully as well. Now that I have that sort of now that I'm comfortable with it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice that you're able to basically use the restriction and to use it to enrich, to add something to the session.
Yeah.
So how to play with restrictions to create something that wouldn't have been there otherwise.
Yeah, I think, yes. I think the only challenge, and that's maybe a challenge that I'll never overcome, is that you can't get beyond that point sometimes. So you're always the foreigner. So you always come with that language and the accent and I find sometimes that it's getting a bit better. But in the beginning, I would facilitate a workshop, and I would be like, we would be for 4 hours elaborating on very interesting topics. And at the end, people come to me and they say, wow, your Portuguese is amazing. But like, really? After all this, that's your takeaway? So I'd be so frustrated. Like, we had such a connection, and now this, and they mean, this happens to everybody. Sana told me the same about her Dutch. Like, people are still like, wow, you're Dutch. So this happens everywhere. It's a compliment. And I don't think people should stop saying these things, because I think it's always nice. But it's hard for me still to get across this threshold of the foreigner, the outsider. Yeah, and I get wonder, that. Because they always come to you, even if it's not about your Portuguese, they'll be like, I was in Amsterdam 2 years ago. Like they want to connect with you about your culture. And you're like, let's focus on what we're, so it's hard sometimes. Yeah.
And I guess, especially as a facilitator, you want to be complimented for the questions you asked, or for the synthesis you did, and not for the language skills you brought to the space.
Yes.
And so it's how you apply the language what counts. And then it almost sounds like a reduction, although obviously it is a compliment.
It's meant as a compliment.
And especially,
it's nice. Yeah.
Especially people, they really appreciate if you learn their language.
Yeah.
So
well, this is something I think is very interesting what you said before about inclusivity, right? Because I grew up in Holland where we feel switching to English is a way to include people. So we are super pragmatic. Like if we hear the slightest accent, well, you must suffer from this. We switch to English. Oh no, let's just.
That's why I still haven't learned Dutch.
Exactly. It's impossible to learn Dutch. It's like a conspiracy, right? Like nobody can learn this because we feel in this sort of pragmatic, like inclusive. Let's all just speak. So, and then coming to Brazil, it's the opposite. People think it's really rude if they continue to you in English because you need to be given the opportunity to speak Portuguese.
Oh, that's so sweet.
It's wonderful. So I had a lot of friends in Benfica who also speak really well English. And I know that because I did speak English with them. They suddenly just stopped speaking English. They're like, done. Now it's enough. You've had your time. We speak Portuguese now. And it's actually a sign of inclusivity. They want me to be really included. So it's so funny how we feel that sometimes we exclude and include by switching to English or helping people to speak in a local language.
Yeah, very good point. Hello, listener. Are you tired of listening to my podcast voice praising our sponsor Session Lab in each episode? I think it's time to pass the mic over to you. So if you are as much of a Session Lab fan and user as I am, please share your experience and praise, and don't be shy of add a sentence of self-promo. Send me your soundbite, and you might hear yourself on the next show and find your name and URL in the show notes. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.